attitude, especially the bodhisattva path, this attitude, whereas Lama Zopa talks, he says, well, you have this unbearable compassion, the way they say, unbearable compassion for all suffering sentient beings. And then the attitude of the bodhisattva is quite a unique characteristic of the bodhisattva level of compassion. And actually it's actually called great compassion, which is really a technical term, mahakaruna. It's quite a precise level, it's quite specific. So this is the unique characteristic of the attitude of the bodhisattva path, the Mahayana path, the component that we're discussing here, the compassion wing. So compassion is, it's a state of mind, and it can start small, but you grow it. And what it is effectively is what we call empathy for the suffering of another. I know often in modern psychology, there are these different, empathy and compassion are seen as different, but in the Buddhist view, they're essentially synonymous. And what it is when you see someone suffering, you kind of this, oh my goodness, look at that suffering. This is unbearable, and you wish they don't suffer. That's the attitude. That's what empathy is, compassion. Now, great compassion is this extra level that one has to cultivate that says, what can I do to fix it? So His Holiness would often refer to it as a universal responsibility, or this personal sense, a sense of personal responsibility. So we understand this when it comes to like our children or our little pussycat or our dog. We know, in other words, we know it's our job, don't we? You don't see your dog suffering and then think, oh my God, the poor dog is so suffering. I wonder who's going to help it. You know it's your job, and it's a good way to put it. Well, bodhisattva is a person, when you've really cultivated this view, we have to practice it, who just knows it's their job. It's their job description. It's almost, how they often talk about the mother sentient being. So one way of developing this compassion is as if every sentient being is your mother. But another really powerful one is like you're the mother, and every sentient being is like your child. That we understand. Any mother, reasonable mother, would know it's her job. She doesn't see her child drowning, have unbelievable compassion, and look around wondering who's going to save her baby. Even if she can't swim, she knows it's her job. That's what great compassion is. So, of course, you have to cultivate it. It doesn't come naturally. And why? Is because right now, until we've developed this level, we've only got compassion for a small group. So our compassion at the moment is really limited. We've only got compassion, one, for a small group, but two, our definition of compassion is really limited as well. So this is where, when you look at the Buddhist view, it's really quite shocking the level the Buddha is suggesting we can accomplish. And this is where, unless we've done the work in the wisdom wing, unless we've done the nuts and bolts of understanding karma, understanding what suffering is for yourself by knowing the Four Noble Truths, that's for you to know your suffering, all the levels of suffering, there are 3 levels, and the causes of it, and the wish to be free of it, and the work to do that. That's for you. That's your work. That's the wisdom wing. And if you don't know what suffering is, and you don't know what the causes are, then you cannot have proper compassion, because the suffering we've all got is something the Buddha says we all share. It's equal. We're all in the same boat. So the way to start on that is learning clearly the Four Noble Truths, knowing what Buddha means by compassion, knowing what suffering, because compassion is empathy with someone suffering. So we've got to be clear about what compassion is. That means we have to be clear about what suffering is. And that's all done in the wisdom wing. So if you're just trying to leap into the compassion wing, the way Buddha's talking about it, it's too limited. And we get exhausted and drained and give up because we haven't done enough work on ourselves. So as His Holiness says, compassion is the point, but it's not enough. As Lama Zopa says, meaning well is not enough. This is a very telling way to put it. We mean well, absolutely, but we rush in like fools with not enough wisdom. And often we make a mess when we try to help others. We know that, or we don't know how to help others. We're lost, That's what you get from the wisdom wing. It sounds very abstract, wisdom wing, but it's really where you're working on your own self, understanding karma, understanding your own suffering, being sick of suffering, giving up causing it, because the Buddha says we're all in charge of our own suffering and happiness. That's the fundamental view of karma. When we begin to know that for ourselves, we really become more brave. Then when we understand what our suffering is and what causes it, we look around and we go, my God, we're all in the same boat. There's no difference, But the other thing, the radical point, as I'm saying, is to understand the different levels of suffering. And this is Buddha's unique approach. So right now we know, if we talk about what the Buddhist view, we can divide all the sentient beings in the universe into 3 categories: friends, enemies, and strangers. It's an odd way. We don't talk this way. Friends, enemies, and strangers. A friend is one whom you have attachment for. Therefore, whom you do love and whom you do have compassion for, that's the only group usually. The one, basically, and this is where it sounds brutal, when we've got attachment for somebody, and as long as they fulfill my attachment's needs, my beloved baby, my beloved husband, my beloved doggy, as long as they keep making me happy, and this sounds brutal, but it's true, then of course I will want them to be happy. May you be happy, that's the definition of love. May you not suffer, that's not the definition, but the essence of compassion. So love is may you be happy. And when you have the big love, wish, what can I do to make you happy? And when you have compassion, may you not suffer, and what can I do to take it away? That's the brave attitude. But let's look at what suffering is. This is the difference, the radical difference. So the Four Noble Truths, the very first of them is there is suffering. And Buddha points out 3 levels. And each, if we're familiar with the Lam Rim, that packaging of Buddhist teachings, that especially the Gelugpas, our tradition in Tibet, it's the structuring of all the Buddhist teachings in this orderly way, orderly according to the disciple's capability, or in other words, psychologically orderly according to your own capacity. So the very first level of practice, which is abiding by the laws of karma, which is the fundamentals of the first level of practice, the disciplining of your body and speech, living in vows, purifying every day. This is your ground practice. And that practice, we are the main beneficiaries of that, because that stops my future first level of suffering. So the first level of suffering is in your face suffering, the suffering of suffering. We all get that one. It's when the bad things happen. Check it up. When your knee hurts, when your husband leaves you, when the terrible things happen. I mean, look at the world, unbelievable suffering at the hands of others, for example. That's called the suffering of suffering. And that's the only one we think of as suffering. But when you do the first level of practice in the Lam Rim, you abide by the laws of karma and do your purification every day. That's the solution to that level of suffering for you in the future. Because Buddha, as we know, Buddha says, my mind comes from before, my mind will continue, and that everything I think and do and say produces my future, my happiness and my suffering. We are the boss. We are the creator, if you like, of ourselves. So the first level of practice, abiding by the laws of karma and purifying the mind, that's the solution to the suffering of suffering for yourself, for the future. In other words, the suffering of suffering in the future when bad things happen, what's the cause of it? My past negative actions. So by stopping negative actions, stopping killing, stealing, lying, harming, blah, 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 you stop the future suffering. That's the solution for you to stop your future suffering, the suffering of suffering. Now, the second level of practice, which is much more subtle for us, much more nuanced, this is where Buddha calls it the suffering of change. And this is where this is difficult for us to understand. And what's the solution here? Give up attachment, to go to the mind itself and give up attachment and the other delusions, because they are the cause of this subtler level of suffering. So speaking simply, the suffering of suffering is when the bad things happen, but the suffering of change is what we call happiness, which is when the good things happen. So it seems a bit depressing to think when the good things happen, meaning when attachment gets what it wants. The first one is when attachment doesn't get what it wants and the bad things happen. Boyfriend leaves you, gets sacked, etc. That's the suffering of suffering. So attachment is thwarted. It doesn't get what it wants. We have mental breakdown and freak out, or get hurt and harmed or brutalized or whatever. That's the suffering of suffering. So speaking brutally, that's when attachment doesn't get what it wants. Now, the next level of suffering, we call it happiness, because it literally is when attachment does get what it wants. So Buddha calls that a more subtle, nuanced level of suffering, the suffering of change, which sounds quite depressing. You mean I'm not even allowed to have any happiness, So we've got to understand this one. If we want to understand proper compassion for all sentient beings, Buddha says, we have to know what level of suffering they've got, because that's the basis of our compassion for them. So we can see all the first lot. Look at the people terrorized, murders, dramas, rapes, attacks, stealing, lying, harming. Look at the world. It's absolutely clear to see that millions of sentient beings are suffering. That level of suffering is, and we ourselves have it when the bad things happen. We know that's horrible, but that's the only level we have compassion for, and only for our friends. There's friends who are the object of our attachment. There's enemies, we mightn't use that word, but it's the object of our aversion. And then the strangers, who are the object of our indifference. So a friend is by definition a person who fulfills my needs, my attachment needs. So I do love them and I do have compassion. The second level, the ones who don't act, who proactively don't do my wishes, the ones who harm me, Of course, I don't love them and want them to be happy and want them to not suffer. We have to practice that. So we don't want them to be happy. So the ones who harm us, we have aversion for them. We try not to have hate, but look at the world, please. This is a normal world, you know, monkeys and dogs and ants do the same. Then you've got 99.999% of the universe who are, for us, called the strangers. And why are they labeled stranger? Because they neither help nor harm me. So how do I feel about them? Complete couldn't care less, indifference. I mean, we should be embarrassed, actually, to realize we see the entire world through the lenses of our own needs. Think about it. But it's so common to the universe, we don't question it, you know, we say, oh, it's normal, you know. So in the whole compassion wing, the starting point is the development of this one, stepping out of the equation and starting to see how illogical it is. We only have love and compassion for the first group, the ones who make us happy. And that's where, this is the beginning of the development of compassion. So anyway, back to the second kind of suffering. The second kind of suffering, it's called suffering. On the face of it, it's quite straightforward. But it's too depressing to hear it, you know. At the moment, in the Four Noble Truths, effectively, Buddha says attachment is the main cause of suffering. It's the main cause of suffering in this universe. So when it doesn't get what it wants, that's when the misery happens, the terrible things happen, and that's what we call the suffering of suffering. Then when attachment does get what it wants and the lovely things happen, what happens is we grasp at it with attachment, believe it's going to last, want it to last desperately. And then what happens when it doesn't last, and this is why he calls it literally the suffering of change, it turns into the suffering of suffering. So we know it very, very well, but it's too difficult to hear it. It seems too brutal. Look at the simplest example of getting what attachment wants, such as the cake. All the excitement building up, all the anticipation, all the belief that attachment has got in the mind, we don't analyze it, but believe that when I get the cake, I'll get happy. When I get the cake, I'll get satisfied. And even though we know from past experience, it'll diminish, we still kind of hope it'll bring the happiness we want, hope it'll bring satisfaction that will last. But we know, you know, and this is where the analysis, even brief analysis of why attachment is suffering, as Lama Zopa describes, you see, the energy of attachment is dissatisfaction. We are always not satisfied with whatever attachment gets. So that first mouthful, we know, is the best. It triggers the best pleasure. But we have to ask ourselves, why do we crave immediately for the second mouthful? Because attachment is not satisfied with the pleasure it just got. So we think maybe the second mouthful will bring more pleasure. This is all instinctive, but we know it doesn't, but we still keep trying. And then we have the third mouthful, and we have the fourth, and then the second piece. And by now we're getting distressed because the pleasure is diminishing. We know this. And still we're not satisfied. We're sort of hoping the second piece will do it. And before we know it, the third piece is coming, the fourth piece, and you know now there is no pleasure left. It is only disgusting, and you would vomit if you ate the fourth piece. So that's called the suffering of change. There was pleasure there. The pleasure was triggered. Whether it's the boyfriend, the new handbag, the new house, the new job, you name it. Because it's driven by attachment, which over-exaggerates its status, over-exaggerates the deliciousness, over-exaggerates its role in making me happy. So it always leads to the diminishing of the pleasure when you have contact with it, until eventually it actually causes disgust. This seems so mean to point it out. This is not Buddhism, this is scientific fact, but we can't bear to think about it. This is the suffering of change, people. So it's more cruel in a way, because you get that pleasure from that first mouthful. But as you keep stuffing yourself unconsciously, hoping more pleasure will come, we all know what comes is revulsion, acid reflux, stuffed, diarrhea, and feeling guilty. I mean, we know, you know what I'm talking about. I'm using an example, a gross example. What happened to the pleasure? It went, and it's turned into displeasure. It's turned into revolting. This is where practice comes in. The less expectation, the irony is the less expectation, the less hunger, the less emotional hunger, the more actual enjoyment could come, you know. So there's this whole practice of disciplining our mind and body and speech. There's all the wisdom wing. So generally all the pleasure of the Buddhas, all the pleasures we have on the basis of getting what attachment wants, the boyfriend, the house, the job, you name it, at some point it diminishes and changes into suffering. Even if it's simply called death, it'll go. We sort of know this, but it seems cruel to point it out, doesn't it? Because then we think, well, excuse me, mate. Come on, Buddha, what chance have I got? What's my option? We can't see an option. That's all we know. So we can't better look at it, you know. And this is where actually all Buddha's telling us, not as bluntly as I'm saying it, that, hey, guys, I have found a method of how to get happy. Happy feelings, pleasant feelings. It's pretty fun. It's a very clear description of what pleasant feelings and happiness mean in Buddhism. It's just a state of mind, happiness, pleasant feelings, joy. Buddha's view is, you know, that he says, you people, what I've discovered is this, that you think pleasant feelings, joy, bliss, happiness come from getting when attachment gets it what it wants. No, he says, what I have found is that actual joy, and this is where there's detailed descriptions in the text about the nature of our mind, when it's unencumbered by delusions, it is in the nature of bliss. This always sounds so cosmic to us. This is logical Buddhist teachings, you know, that he's saying the mind is such that when you've given up attachment, given up craving, given up anger, depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, and all the other junk, which he says we can do, once you've given that up, what you're left with is joy, happiness, fulfillment, contentment that won't change into unhappiness. This is literally really what the Buddhist path is about, you know. So it's not as if he's trying to get us to stop being happy. He just says the methods we use aren't working. But we've been trying them for eons, he said. So if we don't understand this level of suffering, then how could we possibly have compassion for all the people that we see on this planet who are supposedly happy? It is happiness, but it's coming from getting what attachment wants. All the rich people, all the joyful people, all the people in love, all the happy people who just have, you know, who get nice things and have nice houses and nice money and jobs and things and not much too much pain in their body and their life's going well. You'd think, why should I have compassion for them? They're called happy. But Buddha says it's a more subtle level of happiness, of suffering. It's leading eventually, when attachment finishes, it's leading to this, back to the original, to the gross suffering, the suffering of suffering. When the husband leaves you, when you die, when you get cancer, when the money runs out. It sounds kind of depressing because we don't want to think about it like that. Because one of the instincts, when we've got attachment and when we get what attachment wants, we then do another mistake and dump permanent onto it. Now we say, finally I found happiness, we'll say. Finally I found the job I want. Finally I've got the right boyfriend. Now we will be together. As I always quote dear Nicole Kidman when she was with Tom Cruise, I always quote this. I love the woman. When I interview, you know, I read an interview in Vanity Fair. I'm not being mean about it. She's just a good example, that's all. She said at the end of the article, we will be together until we are 80. So what she meant was she believed it was permanent. That's what we all do because it's so unbearable to think that that happiness you're having now will change. It's unbearable to us. So we put another fantasy on top that it will last forever. And this is how we all live. We live in la land, Buddha says. So we want happiness. And Buddha says this is the fundamental drive that drives every living being in the universe, the wish to have joyful feelings, the wish to be content, the wish to be satisfied, the wish to be fulfilled, the wish to be happy. They're all synonyms. And the Buddha says, I found a method. That's all. That's all he's saying. Give up attachment, give up delusions, give up anger. That's what he's saying. That's the suffering of change. So when you know that and you see your own suffering and the pain of attachment and the pain of depression and the pain of anxiety and jealousy and low self-esteem and arrogance, all of the symptoms of attachment all coming from attachment, then you'll see the pain they cause you and you'll want to give them up. So if you don't know that level of suffering, how can you have compassion for all the friendly people walking down the street, you know, with their boyfriends and their happies and the husbands and this and the dogs and the mortgages and lives, which look, you know, attachment is getting what it wants. But we're not seeing the dangers of it, you know. So how can you have compassion if you don't realize that? This is much more subtle. So Lama Zopa says, this is what, so this first wing, the compassion and the wisdom wing, it's like the work controlling your body, speech in karma, the first level, and then controlling your mind at the second level. altogether, this is the wisdom wing, and this is what you get, real renunciation from this. It's always such a forbidding word. You're giving up suffering and its causes. When you've got that, Lama Zopa says, when you've got renunciation, the indication you've got it, which takes way to go, is that just the thought of another moment of attachment is so disgusting. It's like being in a septic tank. That's way to go, people. Don't hold your breath, I promise. Because attachment is so primordial, and it's so much subtler than we could even imagine, you know. So all we can do is tackle it at the level we understand it and keep practicing, you know. So now there's a subtle level of suffering, even more. They call that all pervasive suffering. So I like to talk about it like this. So think of attachment as like being the mind of a junkie, craving. So the gross level of suffering is when you don't get what attachment wants, and you're having the nightmare of kind of not getting the cravings, needs fulfilled. That's the gross level of suffering. And you conquer that by giving up the causes of it, which is harming others and living in vows. Second level of suffering, the suffering of change, you give up that one by giving up attachment. The third level, or the first level is like when you can't get the junk. It's living in a nightmare of hell of only having terrible suffering. The second level of suffering is when you get the junk, but it's this more subtle level of suffering. And the third level of suffering is that you're born in the first place on a planet with the body and the mind of a junkie. And the only way to survive is to ingest the actual 5 sense objects, which are made of heroin. Are you communicating with me? The first kind of suffering is not getting any of the junk. You're like living in a nightmare, the suffering of suffering. The second one is when you think it's happiness, but it's actually getting the junk. The third one is that you're born in the first place in a universe made of junk, made of heroin, with a body of the 5 senses and the mind of a junkie, that to survive, you have to ingest the heroin. That's the suffering of suffering. The suffering of, the all pervasive suffering. So to conquer the first kind of suffering, you give up harming others and living in vows, etc., etc. To conquer the second kind of suffering, you give up attachment. To conquer the third kind of suffering, which is the final stages of practice, you realize emptiness and cut the root of all suffering. So now you've got the suffering of change, you've got the suffering of suffering. So what is all pervasive suffering? Everybody has that. We're all born in the bodies and minds of a junkie living in a world made of heroin with no choice, effectively. So to realize emptiness is what cuts the root of all suffering. So if we understand these 3 levels of suffering and the solutions, that's the basis of genuine compassion for every single tiny sentient being, which includes all the harmers, the terrorists, the Mr. Trumps, the pedophiles, the ones we think are the opposite to being worthy of compassion. So when we understand karma, the bodhisattvas actually have more compassion for the harmer than the victim, because the victim is just finishing their own karma and the harmer is just beginning countless lifetimes of future unbearable suffering. You can't possibly even consider this level of compassion unless you understand this level of suffering. And that's why the wisdom wing is the nuts and bolts of the Buddhist path, the Four Noble Truths, for yourself. Then it's easy peasy to look at all sentient beings and realize, oh my God, we are all in the same boat. We've all got the suffering of suffering. We all got the suffering of change. We all think everybody else is the cause of my suffering and the cause of my happiness. So we continually, repeatedly cause even more of it. And we entrench ourselves ever more deeply in samsara by grasping at everything as inherent. So this is the nightmare we're all in, this Buddha's analysis. Of course, it's difficult to hear it. I mean, it's just a summary, you know. It takes us time to comprehend this. It just doesn't come naturally. We have to understand Buddha's philosophy, Buddha's views, his analysis, and then we have to know them in our own mind, really see it clearly, you know. Hello, people. Come on in. Fine. Grab a chair. Come on, darling. Okay, so this is what you get in the wisdom wing. This is what you get when you study the Four Noble Truths. And when in the Four Noble Truths, you're thinking of yourself. You're doing it for yourself. It's like if you want to be a nutritionist to help other people, Guess what you got to learn first? Nutrition for you. You've got to know intimately your diseases. You've got to know intimately the causes of it. You've got to be revolted by it, and you've got to have the solutions for yourself. Then you have the basis for understanding everybody else and having the means to help them. So the wisdom wing is the source, the basis, the ground, the foundation upon which you can then build valid, compassionate actions. That's courageous compassion. The courageous compassion is you see that all sentient beings, and when you really have this compassion, what we can do is grow it slowly, step by step. The more you develop your wisdom, the more we develop the compassion. And as Samsara calls it, unbearable compassion. I mean, when you hear, this is the part for me that freaks me out, it's too much, when you think of, when you read the bodhisattva literature, when you read or you hear, let's say someone, for example, that I know, Lama Zopa talk about this level of compassion. It's like, it's from the moon, you can't comprehend that people can seriously have that level of compassion. But when you hear the evidence of it, you hear their words, you see their activity, you have to know that they really do have this level of compassion. When you read the Buddhist literature, the bodhisattva literature, it's like impossible to imagine we can have that level of compassion, They say when you've achieved bodhicitta, this state of mind, it's like literally awakening attitude, but it's referring to this outrageous kind of paradigm shift in the mind, which is the culmination of love and compassion. Bodhicitta technically is not compassion, it's the result of compassion. Once you've accomplished these levels of love and compassion to this stupendous degree, after much practice, you actually accomplish bodhicitta. You've made this paradigm shift in the mind, where only others now even occur to you. This seems like mental illness in our culture, quite frankly. And because we can't imagine that level of compassion that doesn't incorporate one's own needs. We think if you don't incorporate your own needs, that's why you become used, that's why you become a doormat, that's why you become exhausted. That's what we think in our culture, because in our culture, in our psychological models, in neuroscience, we factor in as normal parts of a normal person, along with love, compassion, generosity, and all the good qualities. We factor in as normal parts attachment, neediness, expectation, depression, anxiety, jealousy, low self-esteem. We think they're normal parts of a normal person. There's nothing in our psychological models that would that indicates that you can rid the mind of these, but that's the Buddha's point. That's what happens in the wisdom wing. So the levels of compassion you have, unencumbered by all the delusions, unencumbered by a sense of a separate self, it's kind of impossible almost for us to comprehend this, So it really needs thinking about carefully, because it's outrageous levels of compassion that they're talking about. Compassion that's driven by powerful wisdom. So it's not weak and sentimental. Often the compassion we have now is weak and sentimental. And because it's polluted by our attachment, it drags it down, which is why we get so depressed when we see the suffering world, or we get so angry when we see the suffering world. It depends on our personality, So we can't conceive of these levels of compassion. I remember discussing this in Florida just a couple of days ago. One fellow there, he said, this sounds like arrogant to talk this way. He says, you're talking about God's compassion because he has a view of a creator, right? It seemed impossible to think an ordinary human being could develop this level. Well, that's what Buddha's saying, we can. It's not just some gooey feeling you get. We're talking serious mind training, serious work in the wisdom wing, lessening attachment, delusions, jealousy, neurosis, finally realizing emptiness, and growing to this insane degree, this stable, powerful level of empathy with the suffering of every single sentient being. I mean, just talking about it sounds tiring, Do you understand? I mean, we know how hard it is to love one person, have compassion for one person. And we're talking all, so it's kind of like, it sounds too holy. I know when I first heard the teachings, it seemed like from Lama Zopa Lama Yeshe, it just seemed insane. I couldn't get my head around this level. It just seemed like fantasy. It seemed like talking about saints. And it is in a sense. A bodhisattva is like what we call a saint in the Christian teachings, But you don't think you can become a saint. You don't go to classes where you learn to become a saint. You kind of figure you're just kind of born like it. Do you understand? But Buddha says we can become it. It's a path. It's a method. So when I first heard all this stuff, it just seemed too high. I couldn't get ahead. I couldn't get a connection with it. And then I heard His Holiness say, and this is something I think we miss hugely in our culture, and I think I've talked about this. He said, if you want to help others, practice compassion. If you want to help yourself, practice compassion. So this is how the Lamas talk a lot. Compassion is by definition for others. But then we feel ashamed or guilty if we hear that my compassion also benefits me. But that's a practical fact. And we have to recognize that. Then it becomes a very practical thing, but we just feel guilty. Even we feel guilty hearing about how the reason first to abide by the laws of karma and stop killing and stealing and lying and live in vows of ethics, that you are the beneficiary of that. We think, oh no, that sounds selfish. Oh, I can't think like that. So that's a big mistake we make, I think. We have to see that I'm the beneficiary of living, of not killing, stealing, lying. And you know, as Lama Zopa says, you are the main beneficiary. That's that level of practice in the beginning. But the rats and roaches, they'll be happy. You'll leave them in peace. They'll have a party. So they are the beneficiaries. But all the first level of practice, the wisdom wing, the first and second scopes of Lam Rim, you are the main beneficiary of that level of practice. It is your practice for your benefit that you live by the vows, ethics, don't kill, steal, lie, and purify. So you should be delighted with that. You're training your mind to give up your own future suffering. It's very logical. So be delighted with that. You are the beneficiary. Be so happy. Now, even compassion, the first stages of developing it, one of the logical steps in these 11 stages of cultivating bodhicitta, one is to look at the disadvantages to yourself of being self-centered. And look at the advantages to yourself of thinking of others. We think we're embarrassed to think this, but it's very necessary because it's our practice we're describing. That's one point. So anyway, now another thing is to say is if all the first levels of practice, the main enemy is called attachment. So when you've given up attachment, that's like the accomplishment of, until you realize emptiness, but the major accomplishment of the first and second scopes, where you've really got renunciation of suffering and its causes. And that's pretty advanced. So attachment is the problem. Now, on the compassion wing, they frame it differently. As you know, if you've read the Buddhist literature, you're going to talk, you hear a term all the time, self-cherishing. It's called selfishness. We don't use the term self-cherishing. It's the maybe Tibetan, I'm not sure, maybe Indian, I don't know. The term for self-centeredness, selfishness. Now we know it's kind of interesting. We're prepared to admit that we're attached. Oh, I'm so attached to chocolate cake. Oh, I'm so attached to my boyfriend. But who wants to confess to being selfish? It's very embarrassing to think that you're selfish, isn't it? So it's just another way of describing the suffering of having attachment. In other words, because of attachment, just naturally, we put self first. And that's why this seems so abstract within the framework of neuroscience and the psychological models of our culture. It's uncomfortable to think like this way, giving up, putting yourself first. That sounds very weird for us. So we really have to hear it properly, you know. But it's very hard to hear this because it's so instinctive. Because we have ego grasping, the root delusion. Darling, have a chair, come on.
I will. I'll go sit over there in a minute.
You're okay though?
Yeah, okay.
All right, darling. So the root delusion, which gives rise to attachment, and attachment effectively is the main cause of suffering in the day-to-day life. The root delusion, the very primordial assuming in the first place of an intrinsic, separate, a self-existent, inherent me, which is so subtle we don't even understand it. That's the basis of everything. So one of the consequences of that is, one of the consequences of having this, you know, assuming a separate, is assuming a separate self. I mean, it sounds even so weird to assume. It sounds weird to think that the assumption of a separate self is a mistake. I mean, our universe consists of separate selves, and it's important to have a sense of separate self. So it seems so weird to us to think of trying to get rid of a sense of a separate self. But when you realize emptiness, that is for sure, there's no longer a sense of a separate self. You're connected with others, as abstract as that might sound. So the compassion wing is a very powerful method for encouraging that one. consciously breaking down the barriers between self and other, which are caused by attachment, anger, jealousy, and the neuroses, and specifically this one of putting me first. So these are stupendously hard practices, because given that most of us have plenty of attachment and anger and depression and low self-esteem, it's just normal, join the world, you know. This other level of consciously going against putting me first and struggling to practice to put others first, it already implies a lot of work already in the wisdom wing. In other words, if you are an ordinary person, done no inner work, you're a typical human being in your relationship with the boyfriend, full of attachment and neediness and expecting him to make you happy, or the other way around, whatever you want, that's a normal person. No awareness that your mind is playing any role, as Lama Zopa says, which sounds so shocking to us. In our culture, we have no understanding that of the role that our mind plays. We don't think our mind plays any role at all in our happiness and suffering. This is how utterly disconnected we are from anything valid. We really believe that suffering and happiness come from out there. We really do not believe that our mind plays any role. This is how disconnected we are. So when we're a typical person suffering in our usual daily life, low self-esteem and pathetic and sad and no job and the boyfriend, blah, 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 never having enough, not enough, dissatisfied, normal human suffering person, the very first level of practice is to start on the wisdom wing and to start to it's like to heal yourself. It's almost like to become a better sense of a better self. The irony of being full of attachment and misery is you've got no sense of self at all. It's like you don't exist. You put all your energy into the outside. So as you start to heal yourself, which means lessening attachment, controlling your body and speech, lessening attachment, lessening anger, lessening jealousy, you literally heal yourself and you become a more healthy sense of self, quite literally. Then you carry on to the compassion wing and realize everybody's in the same boat. And you continue the practices that are now emphasizing, lessening self-centeredness, lessening selfishness. And you eventually make this paradigm shift where now others are more important than me. So if you are still in the victim mode of miserable and pathetic and usual human, that is an impossibility. That we would call mental illness when you put others first. We do that now, but rooted in attachment. So it's completely miserable and neurotic. We don't see this. Was why one of the commonest questions is, I'm a really kind person, I'm always helping other people. Why do I get misused? Why do I get abused? Why do I get used like a doormat? We don't understand it because we haven't worked on our own mind. So when you get to this level of beginning to realize your own worth of doing the wisdom wing, you become very powerful. You become very self-confident. And now it's easy to have compassion because you've already, in a sense, you've become a good sense of self, and now you can give up the neurotic parts of that and truly begin to put others first. But it's not easy to hear it. If you read the compassion teachings on their own, without reference to the wisdom wing, which is what I'm doing here, it seems impossible. Like, there's this particular text, and this is really giving the good example, that is famous among Tibetans. They adore it. It's called the 8 verses, and they usually have very poetic text numbers, titles. This is the most boring title possible. They call it the 8 verses, And it's written by one of these unbelievable bodhisattvas, Langri Tangpa, I think was his name, Tibetan, in whatever century, 1,000 years ago. It's famous among Tibetans. They adore it. And I think as an example of this outrageous level of compassion, let me go through the verses. You'll really see my point. This is like fierce levels of compassion. Fierce practices to rip out the neurotic sense of self, which for the Buddha says is literally what's preventing us from truly having bodhicitta, where you really made this paradigm shift, where truly now others are the only thing you think about. And because you've, in a sense, putting it this way, you've healed yourself. You've become this marvelous self. Do you understand? There's a way to put it. They don't say it like that. So these 8 verses are absolutely outrageous. I mean, almost I can't talk about them sometimes. So they're written by this fellow called Rangri Champa. So the first one is saying, the first one even is hard to understand even. It says something like, all sentient beings, in order to get the benefit from all sentient beings, that already is confusing to us. Sounds like it should be for all sentient beings, but there's a really good meaning here. In order to get the benefit from all sentient beings who are more precious than a wish-fulfilling jewel. Well, first of all, who's heard of a wish-fulfilling jewel? None of us. But if you put there $5 million, okay, who are more precious to me than $5 million. So that alone is like, what are you talking about? Try and hear these words. These people mean these words. Don't just say them as all holy-woly and have a few tears of compassion and then get angry at your boyfriend because he snored or something. You know? I mean, we've got to hear these words. They're so outrageous. It's hard to comprehend them. What does it mean? Who are more precious to me than $5 million? Think about that. Who would dare to say that? I'm sorry, but we've got to understand what it means. So this is why the first line, in order to get the benefit from all sentient beings, what it means is this. I use the analogy like you want to become the best doctor on the planet. Think about this. You're on the path to becoming a doctor. You're on the path to becoming a bodhisattva. Same analogy. So what do you think you need in order to become the best doctor? Who is precious for you if you want to become the best doctor? Surely it would be suffering sentient beings, wouldn't it? People with headaches and diseases. And you understand my point? You don't want to just put out your little sign and then administer a few band-aids and say that you were a good doctor today. You'll never become the best doctor on the planet in a million years. You understand my point? So if you're fiercely wanting to heal sentient being suffering as a doctor, and you really got this wish, the more suffering sentient beings you meet, the more happy you are. Can you get my point here? You're the one who want to go to the Ukraine and go to the Doctors Without Frontiers tent and deal with the poor people with their legs off and the blood dripping everywhere. Get my point here? Because the more suffering people you have, the more opportunity you have to heal them, and the best doctor you'll become with that serious work. Are you hearing my point here? The best way to become the best tennis player is you don't just play with some little grade 5 tennis player. You play tennis with Federer. You go to the deep end, and then you'll really force yourself to be the best tennis player, the best doctor. That's the attitude here about, in order to get the benefit from all suffering sentient beings who are more precious to me. So the bodhisattvas, the grist for their mill is suffering sentient beings. Try and hear the point. Because why? Because a bodhisattva wants to rip out all the obstacles in their own mind, which are the delusions, in order to completely be free of delusions, in order to become this outrageous bodhisattva, in order to combine it with wisdom and become a Buddha. I mean, they're kind of like fanatics, I mean, it makes me tired just talking about it. So the level of compassion we're talking here is not just this, oh, the poor pussycat's so suffering, or the poor person down the road, they're so suffering, and then you have a few tears. I mean, sorry, it's just really, our level of compassion is so limited now. This level of compassion is hard to imagine. When I hear Lama Zopa talk, it's just like it exhausts me. His attendant, Venerable Roger, this Australian monk, he says, because Lama Zopa doesn't sleep, he never lies down. Roger said, for Lama Zopa, sleep is a disgusting waste of time. So these yogis, first of all, these tantric yogis, they don't need sleep for a start because they've completely controlled their subtle energies. But what motivates them to want to meditate day and night in the mountains or never sleep, and this is what's hard to exhausting, is their compassion. So the thought of being unconscious for several hours and not working on becoming the best doctor, hear my point, would be horrifying to them, because all this, the level of compassion these people have is like their own children. They have all these dramatic, I mean, Lama Zopa, when he talks, it's just, I'm editing a book of his right now. It's like, I can't get over it. It's just too ridiculous. I can't believe it's possible. Honestly, do you understand my point? I mean, I get tired just reading. I have to put it down and relax and be normal, self-centered me again. I mean, it's like he talks these examples of like this person, this precious person who's blind, falling off a mountain. You'll do anything. I mean, they're so dramatic when they talk this way. At least Lama's Zopa is anyway. I mean, His Holiness is just as compassionate, if not more, whatever, but he talks more normal, you know. Lama's Zopa is so extreme. But if you use the example of a mother for her child, I never forget, years and years ago, I watched on the telly, on the television, interviews with mothers, the outrageous things they did to save their children. Do you understand? It's such a good example. Like one mother lifted up a car to get her baby out, you know. Another mother ran into a fire, a burning house. So they've got attachment. But if you think about it, their total focus, that mother who ran to the burning house, she sees it's burning, right? But what's she thinking about? Only her baby. Think about it, it's very logical. She's completely got her baby on her mind. So she doesn't even see the fire. She goes to get her baby. That's, they say, how bodhisattvas is for every sentient being. This is why you've got to do the wisdom wing first, people. It's really quite outrageous. These teachings are still extant in this world. You know, these amazing teachings over 1,000, 1,200 years in Tibet, practiced by millions of people, coming from the amazing practitioners in India. Bodhicitta is outrageous, you know. It's hard to accept it as possible. So in order to take the benefit, get the benefit from all suffering sentient beings who are more precious to me than $5 million, why? They're more precious because every time you help one, you're ripping out your own delusions. It's every time you heal somebody, you're becoming a better doctor. Every time you fix that leg, you become a little bit better doctor. Every time you have the worst patients possible, the worst suffering possible, you're increasing your capacity to become a doctor 1,000,000 times more powerfully than 40 million years of putting band-aids on. So it needs effort, huge enthusiasm. That's how they talk about bodhisattvas, this insane enthusiasm, you know, to never give up, working for sentient beings. It's hard to conceive of this level, you know. I mean, we have incredible compassion for our pussycat, our mummy, our baby. But I'm sorry, if your baby cries, screams for day upon day upon day, have a look at where your compassion goes. I don't wonder that some mothers kill their babies. We have compassion. It's obvious. It's so limited, though. Because when we start getting exhausted, tired, drained, overwhelmed, anxious, angry, it's like, where does your compassion go? It's exhausting. So this level of compassion is when you've given up the delusions. This is the wisdom wing. This is how they talk. You know? So the final line is, these sentient beings get the benefit from all of these suffering sentient beings who are more precious to me than $5 million. I will see them all as dear, sweet at all times. I mean, we're talking all sentient beings, people. This is just verse 1, and each verse gets worse. The second verse says, and I often joke and say, if you were a therapist and you gave this advice to your client, you could be sued. Hear what I'm about to say. It says, when you're with others, see yourself as the lowest of all. I mean, excuse me, it's so hard for us to hear this. What are they talking about, you know? So the only way to comprehend this, the only person who's qualified to genuinely do that and to genuinely see everybody else as marvelous and delightful is a person who has the unbelievable joy of the self-confidence of having given up delusions. But the only way we hear it is a person who's got low self-esteem and attachment and fears and needs. And if we are like that, with most of us are, we can't hear this piece of advice. It's not possible. Are you seeing my point? So it's a highly advanced practice, but we can try once a month, maybe. So what's it mean? How do we even practice it? Well, my feeling is, you know, you can't say it that you'll do it all the time. It's not possible. But a really powerful way to put it into practice is think of someone you know in your family, you know, at work, who you don't like, okay? And all you got to do is think of something about them that they can do better, or that maybe their nose is prettier, their teeth are nicer, their hair's more pretty. Something simple, people. Their toes. I know when I did Kung Fu, I was always watching everybody's feet, you know, And I'm always proud that I've got the best Kung Fu feet. I always talk about this, and I'm not being sarcastic. I now admit to it. It's 30 years ago. I thought my feet were the best Kung Fu feet because they're short and fat. And my toes are all kind of equal. And I can do a really good Kung Fu kick. You understand? So I would always look at everybody else's toes, you know. I remember Paulette had a bigger belt, higher belt than me, and she was much better than me. So I looked at her skinny toes, and I'd always just decided Paulette was better at something else, you know, instead of my toes, because my toes are better than hers. I mean, you're not laughing, but I'm really not joking, but I'm serious. I'm also joking. So just think of one thing, of one person you don't like that's better than you. It's a powerful practice. You delight. That person's got much nicer ears, a prettier voice. They're more intelligent. They know math better. Because normally we're offended by somebody else being better because we take it personally, you know. So this is a powerful practice. You see, so to hear the words lowest of all seems too dramatic for us, you know, but hear what it means. Praising another person as being better than you at it. It's a powerful practice, but this is not the end. The next line is even worse. And see everybody else as superior. It's the same thing, really. So try and hear the meaning precisely and the benefit of that kind of practice, you know. Put it in different words if you like. Because you see, the instinct of ego grasping, which is the root delusion, which gives rise to intense attachment to get what the I wants, which in the bodhisattva path gives rise to the putting I first. This is what we're trying to counteract. All through these verses, we're trying to counteract the instinct to put I first. So we're practicing putting I second. We're practicing putting others first. That's the gradual practice, you know. So you've got to be courageous to do that. And that's why I'm saying, I remember one Pabonka Rinpoche's in Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand says, you need to be a suitable vessel to do these practices. These are high practices. And that's why we find it weird to think that spiritual practices are different levels of capability. They seriously are. So if you're still in a relationship where you're overwhelmed with self-pity and sadness and misery and no confidence, this is not your practice, people. Believe me, it is not your practice. You've got to know these are advanced practices. They kept these practices secret. I really mean it. Because they're so outrageous. They're against all instinct. I mean, even generally the Dharma, Milarepa said, whatever's Dharma, the world is opposite. Well, this is seriously true, you know, because this is the normal default mode of most beings. That's why it sounds so shocking that these teachings are pointing out that it's mental illness. It's hard to hear it, you know. So the next verse seems to be sort of slightly different from the rest of them. It says, the moment a delusion arises in your mind, which will harm you and others, you will avert it immediately. And I forget something else like that. And that seems hilarious to me, that the assumption here is, when it says the moment a delusion arises in your mind, the assumption is that virtue is your default. Do you understand? And a naughty moment of attachment pops up. Well, it's the other way around for us. Delusions are default. Do you understand? So the real teaching from this is to catch your mind. And this is the really major level of practice in our culture. I think that we were able to do this. We would not have depression. We would not have mental breakdowns. Our tragedy in our culture is we don't notice what's going on in our mind until we're having mental breakdowns. That's when we go to the therapist, and it's just too late. It's like the wheels falling off at 100 miles an hour and you've never noticed the wheels wobbling. That's the tragedy in our culture, I think, because we even think that therapy is a serious thing you have to do when you're really having serious problems. The time to go to the mechanic is when your wheels wobble, not wait till they fall off. So we wait till the wheels fall off, which is our great tragedy. So when we start to get some mindfulness practices and awareness of what the hell is going on in our mind, we can grab them before they become emotional. This is the real wisdom we can get from these teachings, you know. Forget about renunciation, forget about emptiness. This is profound. So this is the practice there, watching your mind like a hawk. And as soon as you grab the little delusion, you hear it, you argue with it, you just solved it. Don't wait till it becomes violent. You want to kill yourself or others, you know. Now the next three are outrageous, and each one gets worse than the previous. I think the first one says, and I've got a feeling this one is sort of in our lives, it's like relating to people out there, not too close to us. When you hear about a person who is like really kind of seriously mentally ill. They say in the text, a person who's evil and really suffering. We'd say a psychopath, let's say. That's a good word for us. We love our Greek words, you know. When you hear about a psychopath, and of course every day we're hearing about psychopaths because the world is so full of suffering, right? I will see this person as a precious treasure. So again, what's the logic of that? When you think about a crazy person, our first instinct is to have aversion, isn't it? Push them away. Here, we're trying to smash delusions, right? So when you meet a person who triggers your delusions, even as distant, you read somebody in the paper or something, you know, you hear about a person who killed 27 people. Then as your delusions arise, so you're glad because this person is attacking your aversion, attacking your attachment. It's a powerful practice. That's the first one, bad enough. The next one I think is coming closer to home. I would say it's like this is at work or in your broader family. A person who basically accuses you of doing something you didn't do. I will take the blame and give the victory to them. This is insane, you know. Do you understand? It's not too much. Excuse me, you know, excuse me, I didn't do it. Right. I'm really sorry. I apologize. This is too much. We know how we feel when even the tiniest accusation comes, isn't it? The tiniest, even a person who doesn't look so friendly at me, we have a mental breakdown because we're so fragile in our craving to be seen and heard and approved of, our worst attachment of all. So this is an incredible practice. When you're actually accused of doing something you didn't do, you literally take the blame, apologize, and give the victory to them. I mean, again, you've got to be a very stable person to do that. Victims love to do that. It's all my fault. The classic victim in a relationship where they're being bullied, that's exactly how they feel, but that's totally not what's being said here. Do you understand? People, it's a courageous thing to do. So I always remember this story. I tell the same story every time. I must get some more stories. This friend in Sydney years ago, my friend George was at this party of a group of Buddhists, you know, the guy who ran the party, John, I think. He told a story about his crazy next door neighbor. Well, first of all, his brand new BMW, he discovered it had been scratched right along the doors, you know, one side. And so he got new doors or whatever, got to fix, whatever. And it happened again and again. And he discovers there's the wacky guy next door, you know. And he said, what should I do? Well, someone said, scratch his car. And someone said, well, I'll tell you what Lama Zopa would do. He would find out what this old guy liked, buy him a beautiful gift of that, and apologize sincerely for anything he'd done wrong. Well, John had done nothing wrong, okay? He thought this was great. So that's exactly what he did. So he found this old guy liked golf, you know, so he bought him these beautiful fancy golf balls, wrapped them beautifully, went to his back door, offered him the gift and apologized for anything he'd done wrong. So he's back in his house feeling good about it. He's a Buddhist. He understands karma and everything. And this old fellow comes in, beaming from ear to ear with his gift unwrapped and said, this is the kindest thing anyone has done. He was so happy. And he said, everything is forgiven. Not that John had done a single thing wrong, right? So that's a perfect story of immediate, the benefits, you know, of taking the blame. You think otherwise, and you read all about this, especially these rich people. I remember there's two people in one of those big fat islands off here somewhere where these maybe rich people go and buy their acres with their $10 billion properties. And they've been fighting for 27 years, having practically millions of court cases, all beginning over some kind of a trash can too far over to the other person's land, you know, and they never give up fighting. And now it's in courts, they want to murder each other, they're accusing each other of endless things, and they will never give up. That's how these things start. You just take the victory, take the blame. But it can't be sarcastic, it can't be passive aggression. And it's really hard because the first instinct is outrage, isn't it? These are powerful practices to literally put atomic bombs under self-cherishing, you know. But you got to know when the right practice. I mean, this is some of all of the Dharma practices are different tools in our toolkit, and you use different ones at appropriate times. So you don't mean you have to do this every time. Sometimes it's best not to do this. You do something else. But you've got to have these tools in your kit, knowing what's the right practice for you at different times, you know. You've got to know your own mind well. You've got to know your own mind well and what is the wisest thing to do. I mean, if your child accuses you, maybe it's not appropriate just to take the blame from your child. Maybe you've got to sort the person out. You've got to have wisdom, you know, not be some kind of martyr. But it's so intensely hard because we know the instinct, even our name is mentioned in a slightly bad way. It's like terror, you know. The third one is the worst. And my sense is this is like your husband or your children. The person whom I've given my life to, I forget the right words, turns against me. And this is one of the commonest experiences of so many people. The number of parents who come to me in tears because their child has rejected them, given them up, blamed them for everything, or the number of children who've been rejected, or husbands or wives. It's unbearable pain. You've sacrificed your life for 30 years for somebody and they give you up, reject you, throw you out. I will see them as my guru. This is intense, you know. You've got to be a suitable vessel for this level of practice. These are the intense secret practices of the great bodhisattvas, to smash the delusions, ego grasping, self-cherishing, and attachment, to quickly enable them to become a Buddha. This is the whole point of these practices. This is an intense level of practice. We have to know what we're capable of, you know, and know the logic behind it, not some kind of self-piteous rubbish. Are we communicating, people? I've done a lot of talking tonight. I haven't stopped once. Let's see what time it is. What is it? 7:20, 6 o'clock, 7. Time for a break. Gosh, time for a break soon. But some questions, please. Anybody on Zoom, Sheila? Or anybody? No, Sheila's not there. Who's got anybody on Zoom got questions, darling?
No questions on Zoom.
Okay, anybody questions in the room?
Yes.
Where? Yes, sweetheart.
How do I know that I'm not bullying myself?
What?
How do I know that I'm not bullying myself, or like where my motivation to pull the tool from this toolkit?
So what? Start again. Please say it again, darling.
It's like, how do I know that I'm not like bulldozing myself into believing that, you know, where I'm coming from?
Honey, listen. What we're talking about here is, first, you've got the wisdom wing, and you really do learn to have wisdom and clarity about where you are at. You're asking me, like, when I'm playing the piano, how do I know I'm not fooling myself? I can play the music. Honey child, you've got to have wisdom. If you've asked that question, then you've got to be cautious. Wisdom means you know what you're doing. Wisdom means you know what you're doing. Are we communicating?
Yes.
So you do your best. You're not perfect. Maybe make a mistake, but you learn from your mind. You learn. This is what wisdom is: learning to know your mind intimately and profoundly, in a most sophisticated, clear way, which we don't think of in our culture. The level of clarity we need about our own mind, the delusions, which means you've got to study the mind, done the wisdom wing, abide by the laws of karma, understand your own mind deeply. This is implied in these practices. And if you haven't done it, then you do your best and you stumble along. Do your best. That's all I can say. Do you understand? But no, I've been trying, darling. It's not going to kill you if you sort of take the blame and then you want to have a little weep. It's okay. Learn from it. We're big girls, you know. Do you understand?
Yes.
But if you're like in the victim mode and you, oh yes, darling, it's all my fault. Bash, please bash me again. It's all my fault. That's disgusting. But to know our mind, darling, this is the key here. Do you understand?
Yes.
Good. Yes.
So you said earlier, and I love this, you have this idea of compassion being very weak and sentimental, right?
Yes.
So I have a question about doing like a practice. I've done listening to your guided.
Can you people hear her on Zoom? You can. Good. Go talk.
Your guided meditations with the medicine Buddha and Tara, and we picture the people are enemies, who are enemies, and we're, you know, picturing Tara and, you know, all these beings of light going from.
That's right.
That. Does it matter that we're just not feeling it?
Of course, darling, it doesn't matter. We've got to start somewhere, sweetheart.
So
It's sort of like,
visualization is okay,
yes,
you've
got to start somewhere. It's like you've got to start somewhere playing tennis. You can't even hold a racket. It's not even qualified as playing tennis, but it is playing tennis, but just hopeless. You've got to start somewhere. You can't sort of say, only when I can play tennis will I try to play tennis. Catch 22. You can't just say, when I've got perfect compassion, then I'll think of it. No, you start somewhere, darling. Mean it sincerely. The imprints in your mind are incredible to do those kind of practices, really. Do you understand?
Yeah.
But know where you're at. Don't fool yourself. Live in a fantasy land. I'm so special, you know. I mean, there's the trouble with us, I think, in our culture. We don't, the attitude, these practices in Tibetan Buddhism are really detailed, precise cognitive therapy practices. They're using logic and analysis to argue with ego's entrenched misconceptions. It's not just sitting down, having a gooey feeling and having some tears. That's very sentimental and very superficial. They're using logic and analysis to smash ego's misconceptions, and you build up those realizations until compassion becomes genuine. It's step by step by step. And it's cognitive. It's a very conscious practice of changing your thoughts. You with me? One step at a time, being very real. Wisdom by definition means absolutely realistic about where you're at. And that is what we must learn. That's the job. Do you understand? But delight in your efforts, darling. You know, I mean, do your best to take the blame when your hubby says you talk too loud or you drank, you slurped your tea or something. Oh, I'm so sorry, darling. And then go away and have a little weep. It's okay. You just did a good job saying, I'm sorry, darling. You meant it. It's okay. So start with the baby things. Don't wait till you're kind of, you know, raped. Oh, it's all my fault. I'm so sorry. Just start with the baby things. Do you understand? Do you understand? And then assess. It's like technical. This is technical work. Like you assess your tennis, you assess your music playing, but we don't think of spiritual practices like that, but it is. You assess where you're at. You assess what you did. It's very cognitive. It's very aware, very conscious. Do you understand? Yeah. What else, people? Time for a break, I think. Yes. Yes, darling. Do you mind taking your mask off just so I can see you better and hear you better? Thank you, darling.
So, I mean, we every society has rules.
Yes.
And those rules are obviously written by people that form the society.
That's right.
I mean, a small community can be a society, etc.
That's right.
And like you said, a lot of people don't have the level of wisdom or not enlightened enough.
A lot of people have what?
Don't have the wisdom.
We don't have the wisdom. That's right.
So the majority of the population doesn't have the wisdom.
That's right.
So if the rules are written by people that are not wise.
Yeah, it's unfortunate.
If you are wise,
Go on, what?
if let's assume that we have the wisdom, but we're playing a game with rules written by people.
Can you give me an example? It all sounds very nice, but I'm getting intellectual here. Give us an example.
So, like, for example, if you look at the world of work, professionalism.
Yes.
That's like banking the most.
Yes.
You're expected to be a certain way.
Yes.
To act a certain way.
That's right.
Rules.
Yes.
That define what success is.
Exactly. So give an example of the problem.
So, for example, you're expected to be ruthless in terms of how you take decisions, irrespective of whether it hurts people or not.
Well, I mean, that's a big statement, sweetheart. I know what you're talking about, but my feeling is if you've got courage and confidence and good ethics, I don't believe you can't succeed in this world. I really don't believe that. If you really believe you've got to stick by that rule, then you don't have any courage. I don't believe that. I think people with real ethics and real confidence who can make their own decisions, if they are really good, they can go beyond that stuff. Living in the fear of attachment and aggression. And that, I think that will be a living hell. I really don't believe that you, and if you don't survive in that particular environment, because it's so, everywhere else is so much garbage, then don't stay. Have the courage to leave and find another environment. That's where we need courage, I'd say. Don't you agree with that?
I do.
Yeah. And you can be, everybody loves a good example. Often I think of these outrageous people. I mean, Steve Jobs, I'm not saying he's a saint or anything, but he's a really interesting human being who lived by his own rules, went as far as he could go, way beyond the normal rules of most people. And then in the end, he got really admired for his outrageous courage. And I don't know what anybody thinks of Elon Musk. I think he's a bit of a maniac, but I'd rather admire the man. I don't know if he's ethical. People think Elon Musk isn't ethical. Is he a good man? Is he ethical? What do people think of Elon Musk? I'm just curious because he comes over. I can't quite work out what he's like. What do you think of Elon Musk?
I mean, I'm dealing with Steve.
What?
Jobs. So I don't think Steve Jobs is a good.
You what?
Steve Jobs.
Yes.
I don't think he was a good human being.
He was what? Not what?
He was not a good human being.
I've got a feeling he had really good qualities, but he looked like he had ruthless ones too. But when as he got towards death, He was incredibly wise in the way I heard things, the way he died. It was really interesting. So I got a feeling he had a lot of good qualities, but maybe he took risks. And then, of course, his reputation was quite shocking. But he risked his reputation to, I'm not sure. It's interesting. I think sometimes it's hard to know sometimes, isn't it? Yeah. Certainly someone like Elon Musk who's got so famous and so outrageous and does his own trip. I'm not sure, but I just got I'm there examples, and that's just personal opinion. But I really do believe you can live in the world of the worst places with ethics and still survive and still exist and still be your own person. I really feel that. I feel somehow. But certain situations, if it's so horrible, then you don't survive, you can leave it. Have enough courage to go. Start your own and run the show. That's where the real courage would come, I think, and lead the way. Do you understand? I feel that. What else, people? Time for a break.
Robina, I have one real question, and it's a small question. If we are not realized, obviously, and we're still trying to work with the second cause of suffering, which is the suffering of change, is there a way to view pleasurable things or events or people that happen to us as that's happening, knowing that you don't want to get really attached, but you do want to? Of course,
that's the real skill. Absolutely. That's the irony, sweetheart. When we give up attachment, it doesn't mean you give up the cake and give up the pleasure. You get your cake and eat it too. When you've got less attachment, you'll get actually more pleasure from the cake and not be sucked in by it. So actually, as you give up attachment, you can enjoy the world more. That's the point.
But my question, I think, is really how are there smaller steps when you haven't managed to already give up attachment, a way to view these pleasurable things that
that's what I'm saying.
doesn't hook you?
But sweetie, that's my answer. I'm not saying you've given, don't hold your breath. Giving up attachment is practically when you realize emptiness. But the process of understanding attachment, distinguishing it from pleasure, understanding the role of the cake, doing the deconstruction of this process, what I'm saying is even as we begin to understand attachment and don't buy into it so strongly, we can have more pleasure and enjoy the cake more. That's what I'm saying, Merwin. That's what I'm saying. And the answer is it's understanding the analysis of what attachment is, what pleasure is, and how they're different. And the whole, it's like an analytical process of deconstructing the whole experience. That's what the job is. Then you can learn to be in control of it and actually enjoy the cake without going berserk, as Lama Yeshe says.
Yeah. Okay.
You're not satisfied with my answer, or are you?
No, I am. I think I am. I think I'm understanding what the path should be. I think I do understand it. I have to think about it some more.
I know. So I think maybe we can talk more about that after the break, because it's really it's an analysis we don't tend to do, distinguishing between attachment. For example, my relationship with Fred, my boyfriend, we have to distinguish between attachment, love, and the pleasure itself. They're three distinct, separate states of mind. So let's just do a little analysis of that after our little break, and we'll see my point.
Okay.
With me?
Thank you. Yes, totally.
Supposed to be a snack break. What do we got for snacks? Something exciting to make people happy or not? Cake. So cake. We've got cake. What do we got? We'll have it we can have a 20. It depends how you want to get excited and have a 30-minute break. You have a 20-minute break. I'm happy to come back anytime you're ready. But have a little break. And I mean, not to try and be all holy, but discuss this. I'd suggest just have a little break and discuss. I'll be back in 20 minutes or half an hour, whatever you think's best. 7:30. Okay, people. All right, darlings. And then we'll go. It's a really important point, actually, because if you can't understand this process of how we get locked into attachment, then we can't give it up. It's not possible. And it's a technical thing, understanding the function of these different parts of the mind. It's very fascinating, and we often don't go into this level of detail. We kind of cross our fingers and hope for the best. But often, because we conflate attachment and pleasure, we often chuck the baby out with the bathwater. Or we conflate attachment and love, and we chuck out the baby with the bathwater. But they're distinctly different states of mind. When we can know this first theoretically, it gives us a basis for knowing how to navigate pleasant experiences, sweetheart. Okay? So I'll see you in half an hour, everybody. I'll just delete you all and we'll come back later. Questions, everybody? More questions? If maybe you're doing a discussion, you had some questions. If there's any questions, please ask. Yes.
Yes, I'm asking about because of a personal situation.
Yes.
I'm about to start working in a hospital for the first time, and I'm thinking about compassion interpersonally.
Yes.
One thing,
Yes.
but how to practice with when you know that you're participating in a larger system or institution that is not always
Compassionate. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is where it gets tricky. It's like your point, you know, it gets tricky when you have to deal with more than one human being. You get two human beings together, we've got problems already, isn't it? We know this. And that's where your wisdom comes in, where, you know, if you don't have the power to make decisions, there's no point in ranting and raving. If you can't influence decisions, you'll just lose your job. So you've got to, any situation, you've got to do the same with you. It's the point. If you have to get to a point where you think it's just not viable to be there anymore, then you must leave. Don't just complain and go crazy. You're only part of it where it's really not being a good system. You know, and that's where it's so tricky working in a big system. I mean, it's impossible to get it all right. You know, and all you can do is do your own best within that. But when you have to be involved in other people's decisions that are often bureaucratic or ruthless, like you said, you've got to decide what you're prepared to put up with. I mean, we often get very noble and want to change the system. You just go mad sometimes. It doesn't mean you give up, but there's so much there's only so much you can do sometimes, you know. Do you understand? I mean, if you're working, I even just think of like working for even just a restaurant where the boss is really good, everything will be beautiful because like everything filters down, you know, or a company like that. But if it's not, then there's not much you can change. It's got to go right to the top, you know. It's difficult, especially the bigger it is, the more complex it is. You've just got to make some wise choices yourself and know what you want to be involved in or not. And know that you can get a job wherever you want and not be too fearful. I mean, what can you do, you know? You don't want to compromise your own ethics in the end. I think that's the bottom line. You have to have your ethics as a starting point. Don't be fundamentalist about it, but you've got to be realistic, you know. That's my opinion. So let's talk about this business of yes, go, please. Yes.
I had a question on guilt.
Guilt, yes.
And a lot of people live with a perpetual sense of guilt.
Yes.
And it drives who they are and everything that they do.
Yes.
Is there can it be filtered down to just one source, or is it different?
I understand. I got to, you know, guilt is recognizing or thinking I did this and I did that and I did this, right? And then we say the conclusion of guilt is, and therefore I'm a bad person. So guilt is an over-exaggerated assessment of your bad qualities that thinks I am that person. And that's frankly, that over-exaggerating is the function of all the neuroses. Anger over-exaggerates your bad. If I'm angry with you, I over-exaggerate your badness and I paint the whole of you with that brush. If I'm guilty, I do exactly the same to myself. Attachment over-exaggerates the deliciousness of the cake. All the delusions have this very specific function of exaggerating. So pride over-exaggerates my importance. Low self-esteem over-exaggerates my hopelessness. And that's the tragedy of these neurotic states of mind. They're not realistic. So guilt is what we run to very easily. And I think the source of it, especially, is this deepest attachment. The analysis, again, of the three main delusions that Buddha talks about that are the source of all the other ones. It's a very clear map. The root one is this wrong sense of a separate self, primordially deep in the mind, so subtle, we don't even have an equivalent in our psychology or philosophy, really. It's about the nature of self. That's the fundamental mistake that causes us to be concrete, solid, and separate and set in stone. Then attachment, to get what that fantasy I wants, is the main voice, this constant emotional hunger. So the grosser level of attachment is always dissatisfaction. So it wants better, nicer sense objects, better boyfriends, nicer jobs, always wants something nice, and it's always out there. But the deepest attachment, the most primordial and the hardest to see, is attachment to how we are seen by others. This runs the universe. And this is the most primordial. So the main drive of this one is I've got to be seen to be a good girl. That means I'm too scared to make decisions. I don't raise my voice. I try to do the right thing because I'm desperate every second to get the right feedback to say that I'm a nice person. And it's terrifying not to get this. So guilt is simply I've internalized God, mummy, daddy, the next door neighbors, the judge, the police, whatever it is. And I do an action and it's like the first instinct is to hide it because I don't want to get caught. And then, oh, I'm a bad person, based upon the assessment of mummy, daddy, God, whoever it is that you've internalized. And you're a naughty person. So then you beat yourself up for it. This is one of our commonest sufferings. So the real one is that we have this practice, as you must know, the purification practice every day. And the first step is regret. But as His Holiness the Dalai Lama said really clearly when someone asked him, what's the difference between this healthy sense of regret, which is ownership, and guilt? And His Holiness was so clear. He said, guilt is, like I said before, you look at what you did. I did this, I kicked the dog, I cheated on my husband, I did anything small wrong, therefore I'm a bad person. You conclude you're a bad person. That's just not true. Before I go further, I remember the Christians have a really nice saying. They say, don't judge the person. Don't judge the sinner, judge the sin. So the regret is that. So I did do this. I did kick the dog. I did cheat on my boyfriend. Then you be more reasonable with yourself. No, it doesn't determine your true nature. It is something you did do. So you own it. And then you think, what can I do to fix it? That's really, really practical and healthy. Guilt is just neurosis, and it's just one of our worst sufferings. And then we destroy ourselves because we paint the whole of ourselves with that one brush. But it's really all about being seen to be a bad person. It's so subtle. Do you understand? Because it's so hard, especially if we live in relationships where we're always abused. And we have this one of guilt and we have this one of self-loathing. It just feeds it. We don't have enough courage to look at it and realize that we're not what people think. But the one of reputation, attachment reputation, because we're so craving to be seen as a good girl, whatever, this is what keeps most people enslaved in their jobs, in their relationships, because we're terrified to make the wrong move. So we even think it's often, oh, I won't do that because I don't want to upset people. It's because we don't want them to dislike us. But it's ever so subtle. It's really hard to see. And so this guilt is always judging ourselves in reference to what we've internalized as the rules of the world or God's rules or mummy's rules or daddy's rules. So always judging in reference to that. Do you understand? So it's very instinctive. But depending on what we've learned, it's very also learned, the rules. You know, if you do all the time, mummy beats you up for doing something wrong, you try to hide it. Of course we try to hide it. So it's very neurotic. And it's just a function of ego. The irony of ego in Buddhism is not some big, strong, healthy thing. It's all this rubbish nonsense. They're the functions of ego. It's kind of very destructive. So to have the courage to own what you've done wrong, and then to know it's not set in stone, but you can fix it. That's so courageous. And realistic. I did do that, but it doesn't mean the rest of me is bad. Got to be very realistic and very analytical with ourselves. Do you understand?
Yeah.
So let's look at this process. I mean, trying to understand the different states of mind in this Buddhist model of the mind. Unless we study this deeply, we're not going to be very clear about it, you know, so we can't do the analysis properly. So there are three, in Buddhist view of the mind, there are three categories of states of mind that cover the thousands of thoughts and feelings and emotions we have. And this is unusual. We do not have this, like in neuroscience or modern psychology, three categories of states of mind. That's hilarious, you know. But it's very clear in Buddhism. It's a revelation, really, if we can start to apply this one. So the first lot, as I'm just discussing, are the neurotic ones. The deluded, disturbing, delusion, exaggerating, distorted, I-based, fear-based, unhappy states of mind. The root one, ego grasping, attachment to get what the I wants, the aversion when it doesn't get it, which is anger or depression or whatever. Then all the other dramas, jealousy and all the other dramas, you know. These simple words that we know so well. These have a characteristic of being deeply disturbing to oneself and of being delusional, like I said about, they exaggerate my badness or my goodness, you know, they exaggerate, they're not accurate. It's quite literal. These are rubbish. And Buddha says because they're not accurate, they can be removed from the mind, which is a very unusual way of thinking. They're all conceptually based. They're exaggerated, distorted conceptual stories, and they're deep in the bones of our being, deeply instinctive. So then you have the virtuous states of mind, the positive, the valid, the reasonable ones, love, intelligence, kindness, generosity, forgiveness. We know these words. We recognize them. These are not delusional. They are not disturbing. They are not neurotic. The first lot are the cause of our suffering and the cause of why we do dumb things to harm others. And the second lot are the cause of our happiness and the cause of why we do good things to help others. It's such a simple analysis. It's unbelievable. It's almost too simple for us, you know? But this is the Buddhist view. Now, the third category are I call the mechanics of the mind. They have another term, but this I find very helpful. These are states of mind that are crucial for our functioning, like intention, pay attention, concentration, discrimination, these practical parts of your mind that are neither neurotic or deluded or virtuous, but are utterly necessary. So mindfulness, for example, is this practical state of mind that we wrongly understand, that's actually an ability to bring your mind back to what you're doing. It's really kind of short-term memory in a sense. So as Lama Zopa says, thieves need mindfulness. They're not virtues. Intelligent, like say, concentration. Everybody needs concentration. A sniper needs very good concentration. There's a part of our mind called discrimination, which is happening every millisecond that can distinguish between this and that. If we don't have that, we're mentally ill. So a sniper needs incredible discrimination to know exactly there's the person you have to shoot. Discrimination, attention, intention, they're all these mechanics of the mind, the way to put it. So now you have to use those and develop those in order to do the job, finally, of distinguishing between the delusions and the virtues. That's the job of being a Buddhist. So now, what's fascinating and initially quite curious, it's a very specific Buddhist view. One of the so-called neutral, and this is very odd for us, but please try and hear me. It's called feeling. It's not an equivalent of emotion. And for the Buddha, there are only three kinds of feelings: pleasant feelings, unpleasant feelings, and neutral feelings. Well, please forget the neutral, okay? So we've got pleasant and unpleasant. Now, we know the word suffering and we know the word happiness, but our problem is we so conflate happiness with the cake and with attachment that we almost think they're the same thing. So if you tell me about your happiness, Robina, I'll describe the event. Happiness is the mind. Cake's not the mind. It's not the boyfriend. It's not the good weather. It's not the event, not the rainbow. But we're so addicted to the outside world that we think not only is that the cause of happiness, but when I tell you all my memories, I'm telling you, I think that is the happiness. So we don't even notice it's the mind. So happy feelings, pleasant feelings, very pleasant, very joyful, blissful, rapture, ecstasy. I mean, I haven't had those yet. They're all synonyms for happy feelings, people, both sensory consciousness and mental consciousness. Then you've got unpleasant feelings, suffering feelings. So when you talk about your suffering, you talk about the ugly boyfriend, you talk about the terrible thing that happened to you. So we're really confusing ourselves. They're mental states. So now, this is where the big confusion is, this is samsara. We all want happy feelings and we do not want suffering feelings. This is a given. The universe is driven by this, isn't it? Monkeys and ants the same. So obviously, if we are in samsara, we're driven by attachment, which is under the first category. So I've got Fred, my boyfriend, okay? I've got massive attachment for Fred, which functionally over-exaggerates his deliciousness, over-exaggerates his role in my happiness. But it's coming from this neurotic, unhappy, dissatisfied, I'm not good enough, I don't have enough, I'm nobody, I'm nothing. That's what it's coming from. So then it projects all this emotional hunger onto Fred and makes him, an attachment makes him appear divine. And then you believe he's the cause of all your happiness, and then you cling to him and expect him to make you happy. And then that's all a function of attachment. And it's a delusion. It's neurotic. It's ridiculous. It's distorted and exaggerated. And it runs the universe. Now, that's attachment for Fred. Now, alongside that attachment, luckily, we have our virtues. They're our saving grace. So I do have love, and love is in that category. Love is a virtuous state of mind. Love is a delight in Fred's happiness. Of course, I love Fred, but we assume they're the same as attachment. They're as different as we say in England or Australia. They're as different as chalk and cheese. They look the same, but they're completely different. So love is a virtue, love is valid, love is reasonable, love is delighted, love is empathetic, love is connected to others. Attachment by definition is I-based, separate from others, delusional, living in la la land. But they so come together, we don't even think they're different. And anyway, we don't have attachment for anybody that we don't love, and we only love those we're attached to. So it's hugely important to distinguish between these two. This is our major practice. Then you've got feeling. So now we all want happy feelings. Please try and get this concept that they're neither good nor bad. They're not virtuous or non-virtuous. They're not deluded or virtuous, but they're fundamentally just in the mind. They're like the mechanics of the mind. So attachment's job is to get the object that it believes that such when you get contact with it, happy feelings will be triggered. Now, nothing wrong with happiness. Buddha's telling us, hey, honeys, when you've given up delusions, you're going to have such a happy mind, you won't believe it, and it won't change into an unhappy mind. This is exactly what he has found. When you've cut delusions, this is what liberation means. Your mind is radiantly joyful all the time. Please hear me. As well as being loving and compassionate and wise. I mean, it's so simple. We can't hear it, you know. So as Lama Zopa says, when we hear the Buddha says you've got to give up attachment, we go, oh, I've got to give up my heart. I've got to give up my happiness, because we don't know the difference. This is a very specific model of the mind. So I am absolutely attached to Fred, coming from this neurotic, low self-esteem and misery and emotional hunger, completely over-exaggerate his divineness, totally expect him to make me happy. Because I'm exaggerating, it's not going to turn out that way. And then I do have love for him. So it's easy to love a person who makes you happy. This is the trouble. It's easy to have love for Fred when he makes me happy. We've got vested interest. But let's say Fred gives me up for younger version, my love turns up like a tap, doesn't it? Because now he triggers unhappy feelings. So attachment to Fred, love of Fred, that's great. The third one is happy feelings, when I have contact with Fred. Happy feelings is not attachment. Happy feelings is not love, and attachment is not love, and attachment is not happy feelings. These are three separate states of mind, but they're all working so utterly together in tandem, we can't see the difference. This is intellectual first, this is theoretical. But to even know theoretically they're different is a starting point. Attachment is only the cause of suffering. Love is only the cause of happiness. And suffering and happiness are feelings. So our trouble is that one example is when you do negative things to get happiness is the trouble. Let's say you got the attachment to fishing, so your attachment to killing from past lives, and you meet fishing. Always use this one example of this boy I heard about, and it's common. The little boy, he meets the scenario called fishing at the age of 5, and it's like, because everything he's ever done and said and thought before is programmed in his mind, and the extent of a certain habit when you meet that scenario again is the extent of the happy feelings that arise. So the moment he met fishing, it triggered like a memory, but not really a memory. You don't call it a memory, but his past karma, his past tendency to kill, the moment he saw fishing, and then intensely pleasant feelings were triggered. And then the next millisecond, attachment kicks in and then grotesquely exaggerates the deliciousness of fishing. And of course, because he assumes the happy feelings come from fishing and attachment makes it look delicious, that's what keeps him locked in samsara. And that's how we're all locked in samsara. So for us, it might be the cake. You see the cake, attachment exaggerates its deliciousness. That millisecond, because of your habit karmically as well, with eating, we're all attached to food, triggers very pleasant feelings. So obviously we all are junkies for pleasant feelings. We all want pleasant feelings. So we naturally assume the cake is the main cause of the pleasant feelings. The fisherman assumes the killing of the fish is the main cause of the happy feelings because they are triggered that instant. So this is the false analysis of samsara. This is how we lock ourselves in samsara. So what happens is an attachment kicks in, attachment exaggerates the deliciousness of the cake, believes it's the cause of my happiness. So you keep eating cake, waiting for more happiness to come. But because it is happiness, but your polluted happiness, contaminated happiness, and you tip it down the toilet by being attached to it. And then you end up with no happiness, not to mention more suffering in the future. So it's like a technical analysis of how we construct and continue to uphold samsara. It's all done by the mind. So we have to do this analysis of the states of mind. This is what Buddha does. This is Buddha's deal. Attachment is a delusion. It exaggerates Fred's deliciousness. I'm emotionally hungry for Fred, you know. So the more I have attachment, the more I have hunger, the more divine he looks. And the more I believe he is divine, the more I believe he's divine at his bones, and the more I believe when I get Fred, I'll get happy, and I want happy feelings. Nothing wrong with happy feelings. But we assume getting attachment's object is the way to get happy feelings. And then because of the habit of, you know, attached to boys, that triggers very happy feelings, and you think the boy is the cause of it, so then you become attached to that and you freeze it in space. And then because attachment is a lie, then it lies to you, and then eventually Fred acts like a normal person with ordinary qualities, and he starts, you know, doing what typical people do, and he starts not loving you so much, and then suddenly aversion takes over and you chuck him out. And now unhappy feelings come. So you blame Fred for your unhappy feelings, and you blame Fred for your happy feelings. In reality, this is the shocking part. Every millisecond of every happy feeling you have is like a fruit that just ripened from a seed of virtue 47 lives ago, 27 lives ago, 5 lives ago. There's like a stock of seeds in your mind from virtuous actions. And every time you get a happy feeling, it's the fruit of that karmic seed. So we think it's the cake that causes it, but the cake is merely the catalyst. And then you think the cake is the cause, and you become attached, so you kind of poison the whole thing. The worst one is the killing of the fish, because you think it's the cause of the happy feelings, and attachment makes it look delicious. And so you don't see what you're doing. You're just peeing it down the toilet, all your good virtue. So technically, every moment of happy feelings is literally the fruit of a past virtuous action. Every moment of unhappy feelings is literally the fruit of a past non-virtuous action. And we have billions of these seeds in our mind. So we meet a certain object that triggers or is a catalyst that then triggers a happy feeling. The cake isn't the main cause of the happy feeling, a past virtue is. The killing of the fish is not the main cause of happy feelings, a past virtue is. But then we kill, create more negative karma, and then get attached to it, and so tip the whole thing down the toilet and end up in the lower realms again. So it's like technical. I have to understand this. This is the way samsara functions. Are we communicating people? So more, Lama Yeshe would say, the more pleasure, the better, dear. Pleasure is another word for happy feelings. But it sounds like a sin, doesn't it? Pleasure, you can't have pleasure. But it's just the way beings exist. By having bodies and minds, we just have this capacity for pleasure and pain. But they're not virtuous, they're not virtuous. And Buddha's telling us, when we rid the mind of detachment and the other delusions, we end up with the virtues and joy. I'm not exaggerating. It's Buddha has found this is the natural state of a mind unencumbered by delusions. So the method for the Buddha to get happy feelings that won't turn into unhappy feelings is to give up delusions. That's the method. That's the method. Very simple. Are we communicating, people? We've got to think about it, obviously. It's nothing else as we do in the world. And it's hard, so subtle, because we're totally programmed. Totally programmed. So all of this is back in the first stages of practice, the Four Noble Truths, the wisdom wing. And on the basis of all this, you become more stable, you get less neurotic, less deluded, less unhappy, more happy, more fulfilled, more joyful, more content. That's the irony. Then when you do see suffering, it won't drag you down. Now, when we see suffering, we get dragged down and become despairing because we haven't given up attachment to the delusions. See, attachment is like a junkie that only can cope with everything being lovely. It's a junkie that wants everything to be nice. So obviously, when attachment doesn't get the nice things, aversion arises, or anger, or annoyance, or despair, depression, depending on your habit, and we have a mental breakdown. We go between these two 1,000 times a day. When you've lessened attachment and lessened aversion and lessened all the neuroses, you are stable, you're fulfilled, you are joyful, and that cannot be disturbed. Then when you see compassion, you see suffering, you have courage and enthusiasm. I must help. I understand that suffering. I've been through that. Now I can help others. And you stay stable and confident. And the more suffering you see, the more it's grist for the mill for you to get even more courage and more compassion. And it cannot drag you down because you've got less delusions. Delusions are what drag us down, not compassion. This is a shock to hear. And because you have the view of karma, you have an explanation of why it's happening, so you don't panic. And you get courage to never give up helping. That's what the compassion of the bodhisattvas is. One step at a time, people. One step at a time. Any questions, people?
Yeah, I have a question.
Good, sure.
So, based on what you just said, just bear with me 1 sec. So the fishing, and the person who's fishing is getting their, they think they're getting their happiness from fishing based on a previous propensity.
That's right. The propensity for past killing,
Right.
the stronger that is,
Right.
the more intense is the pleasure. This is the tragedy that's triggered the moment you meet it. And let me just say an example. I remember there's always one fellow I mentioned, an Australian journalist, and he was the arts writer for Time magazine for like 40 years. Robert Hughes, he's dead now. He was unbelievably attached to fishing. He talked about the first time he went trout fishing, it was a cosmic experience, meaning he had to have had such strong tendency to kill from past lives that the intensity of the pleasure he experienced, he called it a cosmic experience. That's intense. And he, of course, he believed in the fishing that caused it. We just eat cake. You know, we get, look at us getting sidetracked. Just cake does it. We get so caught up. And so, you know, but imagine if you had the tendency to torture. One of my friends in prison in Kentucky on death row, my friend Mitchell, who's a Buddhist, says, Robina, he thinks of torture all the time. And what you think of all the time is what you're attached to. You can't stop thinking about it. Look at our minds. So our worst thing is attached to cake, or maybe jumping on a boy or a girl every now and again, you know. Do you understand?
Yeah.
Anyway, go on. So go on.
So
the question?
Yeah. So the propensity for
That habit, whatever the habit is.
That habit, but then the karmic seeds that he has, or anyone has, are
Yeah.
ripening on that thing.
What?
The karmic seeds that he has
Yeah.
are ripening on that object. of propensity.
Ripening on that. No, they're ripening in your mind.
Ripening
That
in your mind.
arises the tendency to kill. You
Right.
meet the fishing and it triggers the tendency.
Right.
It like triggers the memory of having done it,
Right.
and then triggers pleasure, and then attachment kicks in and makes it divine.
Right. So the habituation of the opposite of virtue, let's
Yes.
say, would be is also a propensity.
Yes,
And then
the more pleasure, the better. When you have virtue, that's the point.
yes. And virtue, so not the feeling, nice feeling,
Pleasant feeling.
pleasant feeling
Or-
is itself also a propensity, right? It's also
Pleasant feeling,
It's not
it's just-
self-existent.
No, of course not.
pleasant
It's
or
just the mind.
self-existent.
There's
Right.
always another pleasant or an unpleasant feeling in the mind. Always just a pleasant or unpleasant, depending on the karma you've got.
Which
Yes.
is
So
also
then,
based on habituation,
of course it is.
right?
Of course it is.
So everything we're labeling pleasure or pain
Yes.
or suffering
Is
is
a te-
also just another
Yeah.
propensity.
Exactly.
Right.
It's a tendency in the mind. Yes, it's in the mind, so it's a tendency. Or it's a mental state.
Right.
Yeah. So then, question.
So like but there is something so I was in the sunshine today, I was in the park, and there is a propensity for me to feel pleasure in the sunshine, right?
You have a tendency to be pleasant. In this particular life, having sun on your body triggers it. Some people get burned, so it doesn't trigger it. It might trigger suffering for another person.
Right.
So that's your particular karma. Your sunshine triggers. But as long as you don't get too much, then it'll frizzle your skin up and it'll be terrible. So you've got it. But at the moment, yes, we agree. So then,
So we can basically program through propensity and immediately.
Sorry, what?
Through what we label as virtuous practice, which is a label.
well,
Right.
everything's a label. That's a given.
Yeah.
Just say it. Virtuous
we-
practice.
We can then habituate the capacity to experience emptiness directly.
Well, what's happening leaping there for? Lost me there. What happened?
Well, because if everything is a programming, right? If every
Oh,
even
every
when we're able-
millisecond of what goes on the mind they say it's a fruit of a seed.
Right.
Programming is a good way to put it.
Mhm.
When you keep practicing piano, you're programming your mind with a tendency to play piano, aren't you?
Right.
So then what's suddenly leaping to emptiness? Well, that lost me. What are you talking about?
Well, like then we're talking about reprogramming our habits and getting pain or pleasure, but even that is a programming. So we can get to the ground level of what
Listen,
we're even thinking.
It's
of
almost a
experience.
byproduct. Don't worry about that. What we're trying to do is realizing Buddha says that every mind has the potential to be blissfully joyful all the time without changing into suffering feelings
Mhm.
by giving up delusions and harming others. That's the way to put it. It's Buddhist methodology is Buddha's technique to get happy.
Right.
The goal is to get happy. That's the wisdom wing. Then the goal is to get compassion as well and help others get happy. But the goal, liberation from samsara, is literally having a happy mind, a mind that's free of delusions.
Which is happy is a relative phenomenon, right?
Everything's relative. What are you talking about? You're saying that like as if it's unusual. Everything's relative. Everything's dependent arising. A happy feeling is a happy feeling.
Right.
It's called happy. You've got to label it and define it in a certain way. It's a given that it's dependent. Everything is.
Mhm.
Don't have to add that.
Is it just because we're using language to define the nature of mind that it's
Well, don't make it more complicated, darling. I hear you, but don't make it more complicated. Just speak words. Buddhism is a method to get happy. It's as simple as that. That's the wisdom wing. Buddhism is a method. He says he's found methods to stop suffering. Another way of stopping suffering is getting happiness. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
And suffering and happiness are states of mind. That's it. And his method for getting happy all the time and never changing into suffering is by realizing, stopping harming others, number one, which stops the suffering of suffering. Stop your delusions, which stop the suffering of change, and realize emptiness, which stops the all pervasive suffering. So the three levels of practice are the three methods to stop suffering and its causes. And then you achieve nirvana, your cessation of suffering and its causes. Flip it over, you now experience total happiness and joy that can never end because your mind is endless. That's the way to say it simply.
Mhm. Thank you.
You understand?
Mhm.
Communicating.
Yeah.
So the first level to stop the suffering of suffering
So-
is you give up killing and stealing and lying and harming others. Stop the suffering of change. You give up attachment and delusions. You give up all pervasive suffering by realizing emptiness. Then you're out of samsara, baby, and now you're happy forever and eternity. I mean, it sounds ridiculous talking this way, but that's exactly what Buddhism is. It's a method to get happy. Are you communicating? And Buddha's found the nature of your mind, even conventionally, when you've quit delusions, is insanely happy. Lama Yeshe talks in Mahamudra. Most of the lamas don't go on about all this joy and bliss, gets us all excited, and we lose the plot a bit, you know. He's into that. He wants to try and get us to see that we've got this potential instead of being miserable, you know. All the self-pity hippies talk about self-pity me, he said. So anyway, he talks in Mahamudra, just getting single-pointed concentration. Forget emptiness. He said you can't even imagine the ecstasy, the rapture that your mind experiences, the clarity, the brilliance of your mind pervading the universe as if it were pervading the universe, knowing everything perfectly. That's just shamatha. We've had it countless lifetimes before you even realize emptiness. He's trying to get across this simple fact that our mind has the potential to be insanely happy, but it sounds ridiculous talking like this to us, you know. You with me? And the method isn't cakes and boyfriends. Or fishing for that matter. The method is stopping harming and get rid of delusions. It's as simple as that. That's Buddhism. Do you understand? Okay. And then you add bodhicitta to the mix, which is insane. Then you never stop helping others. Okay? All right. Thank you so much. Any questions? Please be here. Where are you?
Hi, how are you?
Go. I'm well. Huh?
I just want to ask you that you were talking about a piano,
That one?
right? How do we unattach from passions?
What, sweetheart?
Passions,
Compassion.
not compassion, the word passion itself. How do we
Passion.
unattach with the passion that we have for yourself?
Can you say that again? I would love to. Oh, my ear's a bit weird. Hang on.
I'm so sorry. How do we?
I want to hear you better. Go on.
How do we unattach from passions? That we
Oh, I see. Passions.
Yes.
Would you not think I'm kind of passionate?
Yes.
Okay, then. Well, it's possible to be having no attachment and be passionate. Yes. Yes. okay? I'm not saying I've given up attachment, but it's possible because you're joyful and happy and there's no danger now of getting grasping at it. You just aid, but slowly, darling, one step at a time, okay? And know this technical process, the methodology of it is quite important to understand. Slowly, darling. That's what I can see with Lama Yeshe when he first met all the hippies in the 70s, like pathetic self-pity load of nonsense. Or he says, you people don't even know how to be happy. You know how to suffer, So he tried so hard. He talked about tantra all the time, trying to lift us up from this self-pity, pathetic, so horrible me, He tried to get us to see that it's possible to be happy. I mean, Buddhism, you can't hear this very well in the teachings. It sounds so forbidding, Give up attachment, give up anger. It sounds so depressing. There's another way of showing it, which is encouraging, Yes. Yes, Eileen. Hang on, darling. Eileen. Yes, good. Go, sweetheart.
Yes, Eileen, go ahead. Eileen on Zoom has a question.
Yes, honey child. Unmute, precious one.
Sorry, thank you. If you're in, quote, a helping profession, where your role as a professional is to help people in some way, and you start feeling frustrated, I'm not helping enough, impatient, whatever it is, this is not about burnout. This is about having attachment.
That's right, precisely.
Attachment to the way I think it should be.
That's the whole, we can really, Eileen, this is the thing. It's so clear, but it seems like so brutal describing it like this. We make it more complicated in our culture. The bottom line is attachment and aversion, these two run the show. Attachment is the boss. It's this junky mind that every millisecond only wants what I want, which means what I think is nice. And that can be in a multitude of ways. We can see it. Some people want it. It's the food, the boyfriend, the shape, the size, the color, the ideas, the way things should be done. We're all attached to something. Then the millisecond our attachment is thwarted, especially when it comes to working in organizations and other people do things differently. Then we have aversion. So that could be angry, shouting and yelling. It could be more mild, like you just said, frustration, annoyance, irritation. They're all mild versions of aversion, or it can then eventually become depression. And that's why we go crazy. So when we have all of those and you're working as a nurse in COVID, when the worst nightmare of it all was happening, and you'd come to work with your compassion, which is real, genuine compassion, and you are overwhelmed by the nightmare, your attachment every second is not getting what it wants, your aversion is overwhelming, and for you it manifests as unbelievable depression, and you finally kill yourself. This is the tragedy, Eileen. Yes. So bodhisattvas are like ridiculously perky. They never give up and they never get depressed, and they never, because they've given up attachment and given up expectations. And they have this massive courage that no matter how much it is, they do what they can. And then if they have a little sleep and they get up again and they keep going. That's what we have to learn to do. And then we will not get overwhelmed by the suffering. This is the thing that seems crazy in our culture. We assume that other people's suffering, that our compassion is what makes us depressed. No. It's our attachment and our aversion. It's almost a simple analysis, but it almost seems too simple to us. And it almost seems sometimes quite brutal. This is a fact. We can see it as we progress. We get more courageous in the face of suffering because we know why it's happening. We understand karma, and we know we only can do what we can. But then this fierce attitude of the bodhisattvas to keep getting better and better and better at it, because then they never give up. They've got this courage of the bodhisattva,
Thank you.
Yeah, you understand, Eileen? We never can do enough because the world is unbearably suffering. We can see it's the beginning of time it's suffering. And attachment only wants it to be all lovely. Yes. Attachment can't stand problems, basically. And that's when aversion arises, and it becomes depression or guilt or anger, and we go crazy one way or the other, Do you understand?
I do. Thank you.
Really hard to see it though. But this is the Buddhist analysis, and it's quite specific. To look into it,
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, John. Thank you, Eileen. Who else, people? What else, sweethearts? Anything else? What's the time? 8:34. Okay, we've got till 9 o'clock. Okay, people, come on. Yes, sweetheart. Yes, yes, yes. Then you next. Next, yes.
And Robina, what about low self-esteem? Is that an aversion? Is that
Low self-esteem is one of the delusions, and its job is they all over exaggerate. Remember, it exaggerates your badness. And this is a bit embarrassing to hear it, but we've all got it. Low self-esteem is the flip side of arrogance. Arrogance over-exaggerates, overstates our importance. So it's very hard to hear this because it sounds rather cruel. We are very happy to admit to low self-esteem, and it's one of our major sufferings, but it's related strongly to arrogance. So low self-esteem, in a way, is when you see other people who are better than us. We refer ourselves to them, and then we think, well, I'm hopeless. It's almost in a sense, how dare they be better? So we get completely depressed. We are judging ourselves in relation to others who seem to be better than us, and we put them up and ourselves down. It's completely nonsense. We all do it. Arrogance is just the same. You overstate everybody else's lowness, and I'm up high here, you know. We don't like to admit to that one, but if we didn't have arrogance, we would not have low self-esteem. We would have humility, and we'd be content with who we are, and we'd be delighting in other people's good qualities. That's what we have to practice. But low self-esteem is a major suffering in our culture because we've got arrogance, and it's really hard to hear this. It's too hard to hear it, but it's really true. Because when we are low self-esteem, we are resentful of other people being better. How dare they be better than me? We take it personally. It's hard to hear it like this. It's real pain. It's not criticizing us. We've all got it. What do you think?
I was thinking that in courageous compassion, we have to look at another person, the good qualities of the other person. So in some ways, if you see somebody much better than you, then that in itself is already like,
Is what?
and that in itself already, like looking at somebody who is better than you.
Okay, so I'm not quite understanding you. I really want to hear you. So say it a different way. Explain.
Because if we are going to have courageous compassion.
Okay, so it means you want to see someone suffering and want to have a feeling of empathy and want to try and help. Okay, go on then.
Okay.
Then.
And so it kind of like is so opposite of looking at another person's good qualities.
What's this got to do with compassion?
I don't know. I thought that, you know, well, I guess you have to be very strong inside you to appreciate another person's good qualities.
But what's this got to do with compassion? Why are you mentioning them in the same breath?
Oh, okay, I got confused already.
Yeah, I know, I understand. So compassion would be, if it's the simplest level, you see a dog being hurt.
Okay.
So you see it having the suffering of suffering. So compassion is, oh my God, that poor little dog. And then great compassion is, what can I do to help? You with me? That's the simple level of compassion for the gross suffering. Do you understand? Now, the next level is if you see the man kicking the dog, right? So the first thing we would do is, this is another discussion now, please, but I'm going to get more into this one. Then we see the dog suffering, and the first thing we do now in our culture is look for who caused it. So we see this guy who kicked the dog, and we instantly turn into anger against the guy who kicked the dog. You with me here? Now, the Buddhist analysis, and this is what's shocking, is because we understand karma, that every sentient being, every millisecond is just naturally experiencing the fruit of their past actions. Every moment of suffering is the fruit of past negative karma, just naturally. So therefore, we will have incredible compassion for the dog because it's suffering. We'll also have compassion for the dog because we realize it doesn't know, but it caused this suffering from 27 lives ago. So we have extra compassion for the dog because it's got the suffering of not knowing it's the cause. And as a dog, it has no choice. And then we will have even more compassion for the guy because out of his ignorance of not realizing he's creating unbelievable suffering for himself in the future, we'll have even almost more compassion for him. That's another level of compassion that we do not have. And this is where it's totally based on understanding karma. The compassion and wisdom in Buddhism is absolutely based on understanding karma. There's no sense otherwise. There's no logic in the universe to have compassion for a person who beats up a dog. There's no basis for anything in our culture why you'd have compassion for that guy. Not possible. The only basis of it is understanding the wisdom wing, which includes compassion. It's not your question, but I'm talking this way. You with me? This is the powerful level. And if we don't understand karma properly, which is a big one for us, it's not possible to have this level of compassion. Because the guy is harming the dog. He's full of anger. He's torturing the dog. Pedophiles, look at the harm that people do. They're driven by their own delusions. This is the thing that is incredibly important. Right back to the beginning of our own practice. This is something we do not do. What Buddha's telling us is, this is a wisdom wing, if I look into my mind and I see my own attachment and my anger and my jealousy and my arrogance and my low self-esteem, he's telling me, Robina, sweetie pie, petal, can you see that this is causing you suffering right now? But we know it's suffering, but we want to blame the boyfriend. Do you hear me? So this is what we have to own our own pain, see the pain of attachment and anger and laziness and jealousy and depression and resentment, see the pain it causes me, and then see if ever in my life I've ever done anything to harm somebody. That's the cause of it. Now, when I can see that, I'll understand the guy who beats the dog. He's driven by his own delusions. Can you imagine being born as a pet? My friend on death row in Kentucky, he thinks of torture all the time. Can you imagine being born with a powerful tendency that no one taught you, that you brought with you, to only torture creatures? Can you imagine for you the nightmare of that? You will never have that level of compassion until you know the suffering of your own laziness, your own attachment, your own arrogance, your own jealousy. And we sort of know it, but we want to blame everything else for it. So until we've got that, we don't have renunciation. And if we don't have that, we can't have compassion, except for the dog, the innocent victim. It's not even discussing karma here, you know. Are you with me? We've got to know our own mind deeply and know the pain. That's what renunciation means. You're sick of the suffering. I'm sick of this depression. I'm sick of this anger. I'm sick of this jealousy. I'm sick of this laziness. I'm sick of this attachment. I'm sick of this anger. You've got to be fed up with it. You've got to be exhausted by it. Do you understand? And that really takes time. Then we can afford to have compassion for others, because we know anything we've ever done to ever harm anybody is only because of the neuroses. You don't harm people because of love, compassion, kindness. It's only because of delusions. But this is the big disconnect for us. We love to criticize people. Look at these evil people, because we have no idea about our own minds. So that's why for me, it's such a powerful practice. I'd always use Mr. Trump as an example, right? Like he lied. I always quote this. The Washington Post tracked every lie he ever told. And they've got this list gave him up to 6 Pinocchios for each lie. You know, they list all his list of lies. They kept track of every one. So for me, the perfect example of the wisdom wing, you look at the world, right? And we love to go, look at Mr. Trump lying. Look at that evil Putin. Look at these evil Russians. Look at these terrible. We love to point fingers. We love to criticize as if we're saints, you know. And the best practice is, when I look at Mr. Trump, I go, there's lying, there's stealing, there's arrogance, there's attachment. I say, thank you, Mr. Trump, for showing me my delusions, because I recognize every one of those. That's how you apply the wisdom wing. So everything out there is an incredible learning to help me see my mind, because there's not a single delusion in my mind that I can't see in other people. I mightn't jump on little girls all day. I mightn't, want to torture. But I've got tendencies. You've all got these tendencies. So seeing the outside world is like showing you your own mind. Thank you for showing me how not to be. I recognize that. That's how you practice in the wisdom wing. And then slowly you begin to have compassion, because you realize you're in the same boat as everybody else. Our delusions make us insane. Then we can have compassion for the crazies, the murderers, but it's not sentimental compassion. We think compassion means, oh, the poor thing can't help it, pat him on the head, No, real compassion has got iron. It's iron, it's powerful, it's got so much wisdom, because you know why they're doing it. That's when real compassion comes. You realize it's not they, it's we, you know, this is so important. You know, I never say they, it's we. We are all in the same boat. And until we see the mind, we can't see the same boat. And that's why we harm each other. So can you imagine being born as a pedophile? Can you imagine being born with these habits that no one knows why they got? His mother didn't teach him, this poor fellow on Kentucky death row. His mother didn't teach him to torture. It's a habit he brought with him. It's a tragedy. We don't know. So really, this is the wisdom ring, and that then brings compassion. You know? And then compassion is powerful. It's not weak. What can I do to help? You know, it can be tough. Put him in prison. I'm glad this fellow I know in there is in prison. I'm not happy he's on death row in prison, but at least he's not harming other people. You support people, stop them from harming, you know. So the wisdom ring is the absolute basis of the teachings, and it's to do with yourself. You know, it's intense psychology. Just we don't hear it like this when we read it. It just sounds like religion to us, you know. Because it's ancient Indians and Tibetans talking in 1,000-year language. I'm talking like an Australian. Do you understand me? Or American. I'm American as well, actually. Are we communicating, people? Yes. So we're going to have compassion for ourselves first. They don't call it that, but that's what this is. Be kind. See your shit and be happy to own it. Oh God, I'm so sick of this. You know, be kind to yourself. Not be yourself, not guilt. Guilt is evil. But it takes courage to own it, because we're just old habits, you know. You own it, you can change it. Nothing is set in stone. We can mold our minds into any shape we like, as Lama says, you know. So the wisdom has to come first. It's impossible to do this one. Impossible, this level of compassion. Impossible. It's informed by the earlier practice. Like, you know, physics in postgraduate is informed by university, is informed by high school, is informed by junior school. So first level of practice, junior school, control your body and speech. Next level, high school, control your mind. Next level, benefit others. Next level, postgraduate, tantra. This logical progressive, logical progression, one step at a time, you know. That'll do. Look, it's not 9 o'clock yet, but it doesn't matter. Even though I've been trying to speak slowly tonight, I don't know if you noticed. But it's probably it's about 11:30 p.m. because I speak a lot quicker, so we can finish now. I think enough, okay, people? I think enough. Food for thought. Just keep moving, keep studying, keep reading, keep unpacking, keep having confidence, know your own potential, and know that you've got this potential to be ridiculously happy. And it's not a joke, it's literal, but I don't say it like this, you know. I mean, freedom from suffering and its causes sounds kind of depressing, doesn't it? But full of happiness and its causes sounds rather delicious. Well, let's flip it over, it's the same meaning. Then other people have the same. We're all in the same boat. So you've got to know your own nonsense before you know somebody else's. That's it. All right, people. Jangchub, Semchog, Rinpoche, Make, Panam, Keguchi, Kepan, there's one down here somewhere. If you've got a piece of paper, don't worry if you haven't, don't worry about it. Think. May this bodhicitta, this amazing, outrageous, over the top paradigm shift in the mind that only wants others to be happy and free of suffering, which we eventually will get. May it grow and grow in the hearts of all and never diminish. Jangchub semchog rinpoche makye panam kegyochi ke panyampa mepa yang gong ne gong du paba shog. And may all these seeds be planted this 3 hours we've been together, as many moments as there have been, as many seeds, and they will not go astray. May we nourish them with our practice, with our effort, with our goodness. So we never give up, eventually manifesting as a Buddha. That's it. It's a logical process. Never give up. Have enthusiasm. That's the key quality of a bodhisattva. Enthusiasm. Never give up. Joyful effort, you know. Pick yourself up and just keep going. Pick yourself up and just keep going. Never give up. No choice. That's it. Thank you, people. Very kind. Thank you.